That birthday dinner for his mother-in-law, Ethan remembered it vividly. The warm yellow glow of the dining room lights couldn't mask the suffocating tension that always lingered when the whole family gathered. The smell of grilled meat filled the air, glasses clinked, but what kept Ethan on edge was the quick image he caught in the kitchen. Linda, his mother-in-law, standing alone, bent over furtively pouring a colorless liquid into a glass on a tray. She glanced toward the window, saw Ethan watching from afar, and smiled. That smile was colder than the winter outside. When the tray was brought out, Linda gently slid the glass toward Ethan, her eyes gleaming with fake warmth. "For my dear son-in-law," she said sweetly. "A special cocktail just for tonight." Ethan didn't say a word, just smiled faintly, though his mind was racing with hundreds of theories. This wasn't the first time he felt like a thorn in his in-laws' eyes. And perhaps tonight was when they planned to pluck it out. In the moment Linda turned away, Ethan quietly switched his glass with Richard's, his father-in-law, who had never hidden his contempt for Ethan's photography career. No one noticed the swap. Dinner went on, as usual, until Richard began to sweat, his face pale, as he excused himself from the table. Minutes later, the whole house heard the violent sounds of vomiting from the bathroom. Linda turned pale. Ethan just sat there, calmly slicing the birthday cake, occasionally glancing at his mother-in-law with a gaze so serene it chilled the air. That was the first moment Linda realized Ethan was no longer the easily manipulated photographer she once thought. And from the moment Richard fell ill, everything in the family began to shift in ways no one could have predicted. After that fateful birthday night, when his mother-in-law's special drink was switched and Richard, his father-in-law, ended up hospitalized, Ethan knew things had reached a point of no return. But to understand how it all came to this, we have to go back to the early days when Ethan first stepped into that house, not as a guest, but as a son-in-law. Ethan Carter, 32, was a freelance photographer living in Asheville, North Carolina, a small town surrounded by mountains and forests, where natural light was the finest medium for artful photography. He had no prestigious college degree, no office job, no company health insurance, or stable monthly salary. Things his in-laws saw as the standard for a decent man. From shooting weddings at local churches to chasing deer in national parks for wildlife photos, Ethan had slept in his car, lived on instant noodles for weeks, all just to capture a fleeting moment of perfect light. Then, one day, National Geographic noticed him. Then Time magazine. Then galleries started inviting him. But to Linda and Richard, none of that mattered. Linda, his mother-in-law, was the kind of person who always smiled during dinner but stabbed you in the back with passive-aggressive remarks. She would introduce Ethan to her friends with what sounded like praise, but was laced with mockery. "My son-in-law is an artist specializes in photographing flying squirrels and birds in the mountains." Fascinating, right? Richard, on the other hand, was colder, more direct. He would often ask Ethan things like, "When are you going to get a real job?" Or, "Can photography really provide for my daughter?" Only Sophie, Ethan's wife, stood in the middle, trying to keep the peace, trying to believe in both sides. But within Ethan, bit by bit, the hurt and suspicion had been building. Not because he felt insecure, but because he knew, deep down, in the eyes of Linda and Richard, he would always be the man who wasn't good enough. And that sentiment, that silent judgment, had been poured into the glass Linda so carefully prepared for him that night. A glass Ethan had swapped, so the truth could finally speak for itself. Ethan had never been the kind of man to lose his temper easily. As a photographer, he was used to waiting for light, waiting for the moment, waiting for nature to open up. But even the deepest patience has its limits. And with Linda and Richard, they had reached the very bottom of his. Things didn't explode suddenly. They built up slowly, like an iceberg forming beneath the surface. Every time Linda introduced Ethan to someone as a freelance photographer instead of my beloved son-in-law, another crack formed inside him. It wasn't an incorrect description, but it was cold, calculated. For as long as he could remember, Linda had always emphasized the difference between Ethan and her idea of standards, not degrees or money, but status. In her eyes, a photographer was someone who wandered around with a dusty camera and worn-out boots, not someone who could be the pillar of a family. Richard didn't even try to hide his contempt. He didn't just question Ethan's career. He openly sneered at it with sharp, pointed remarks like, "Ever thought about getting a real job?" Or, "When will you finally settle down so Sophie can feel secure enough to have kids?" Ethan had grown used to those questions, but familiarity didn't mean they stopped hurting. Then, one day, standing behind the kitchen door by accident, Ethan overheard Linda whisper to a friend in a low but unmistakable voice, "Sophie is smart, beautiful. She could have married a doctor, and instead she chose a photographer. Such a waste." That line cut like a knife. Not because Linda looked down on him, but because she had never truly believed in her daughter's love for him. On Linda's birthday night, Ethan had just returned from a grueling 3-week assignment shooting for National Geographic in the Rocky Mountains. He was exhausted, barely having slept a full night. Yet he still came, still brought a gift, and wore a polite smile. A part of him still held on a hope for recognition, even if just a little. But when Linda raised her glass and her eyes flicked toward him with chilling indifference, and Richard tossed out another thinly veiled question about long-term plans, Ethan knew no one in that house ever truly welcomed him. And that was the moment the thought struck him. If they won't believe in me, then let the truth be what terrifies them. Ethan had never been a petty man, but inside him, years of endurance had formed into a thick layer of ice, cold, sharp, and silent. On that birthday night, after enduring enough scrutinizing glances, passive-aggressive remarks, and the overheard insult, Ethan simply wanted to get through the evening quietly. Not for Linda, not for Richard, but for Sophie, the one still trying to be the bridge between two worlds that seemed destined to never reconcile. But then he saw it, in the quiet kitchen, while the others were still laughing and chatting in the living room. Ethan stepped in to grab a hand towel. And there she was, Linda, carefully shaking a small vial into a separate glass sitting on the counter. She moved with calm precision. No haste, no panic. As if it wasn't her first time. When she noticed Ethan standing there, she turned, offering a strained smile. "A special drink for my special son-in-law. You must be tired after that long trip," she said. Maybe it was just vitamins. Maybe a digestive aid. But her eyes didn't say that. Her eyes didn't show care. They were issuing a challenge. A silent dare. "Do you have the guts to drink it?" Ethan said nothing. He smiled faintly, and when she turned away, he quietly swapped the glass with Richard's. A small action, unnoticed by anyone. Except Linda, who froze for a moment when she saw the familiar glass was no longer where she left it. 45 minutes later, the sound from the bathroom stirred the whole dinner table. Richard, flushed and drenched in sweat, writhed in pain from intense stomach cramps. Everyone panicked. Everyone except Ethan, who calmly nibbled on a slice of cake as if nothing had happened. He didn't need to say a word. Linda knew. Her eyes locked onto Ethan's from across the room, no longer filled with contempt, no longer pretending to be polite. They were filled with confusion and fear. Ethan simply gave a faint smile and turned to Sophie. "Would you like another slice of cake?" he asked. In that moment, Linda understood. The artist's son-in-law was no longer someone to push around. And for Ethan, from that moment on, came a new kind of stillness, not from acceptance, but from the quiet strength of no longer needing anyone's approval. The next morning, Ethan didn't go to his studio, nor did he check emails from the magazine. Instead, he drove nearly 2 hours to the lab of an old friend, Josh, a toxicology expert he'd met back when he used to photograph environmental investigations. On the passenger seat was the leftover glass from last night's dinner, carefully sealed in a chilled storage bag. Josh raised an eyebrow as he listened to Ethan's story. "You think your mother-in-law wanted to harm you?" he asked, half joking, half serious. Ethan didn't answer. He just nodded silently. 3 hours later, Josh called back. His voice had dropped, all traces of humor gone. Benzodiazepines, he said. Not enough to knock you out, but definitely enough to make you drowsy, disoriented, and cause short-term memory loss if you drank the whole thing. It's subtle, very subtle. That message felt like a blade slicing through the last thread tying Ethan to his wife's family. He wasn't angry, just cold to the core. This wasn't about being disrespected or dismissed anymore. This crossed into the territory of real danger. From that point on, Ethan began quietly investigating. Through a friend who worked at a pharmacy, he looked into Linda's medical history and found something alarming. She had 3 prescriptions for Xanax, issued by 3 different doctors, all within 2 months. That wasn't normal. Far from it. He started to recall things Sophie had once casually mentioned. Rumors that her mother had been accused of stealing jewelry at the women's club, though Richard had smoothed things over. That Linda sometimes acted strangely during family gatherings, forgetting names, laughing uncontrollably, or staring at someone for a long time before suddenly bursting into tears. Ethan began connecting the dots. This wasn't just a difficult mother-in-law who hated her son-in-law. This was a woman slipping beyond the bounds of normality, who might have done something dangerous without fully realizing it. For the first time, Ethan felt afraid. Not for himself, but for Sophie, and for Linda herself, who might be hiding a storm much bigger than anyone in the family had ever imagined. A week after the birthday dinner, Linda called Ethan with an unusually gentle tone. Ethan, I need some new photos to update my social media profile. You know how it is, my friends at the club are all showing off their edited portraits. I want something a little more professional. Ethan sat in silence for a long moment before replying. Sure, of course. That afternoon, he arrived at Richard and Linda's house, carrying his camera and a thin folder, carefully clipped inside a plastic sleeve. Linda wore a deep red dress and had done her makeup meticulously. Shall we shoot in the garden? She smiled, brushing her hair into place. Before we begin, I have something I'd like to show you, Ethan said, handing her the folder. Linda raised an eyebrow, but took it without a word. Inside was a copy of the lab report, clearly listing the presence of benzodiazepines in the glass of water. Alongside it were printouts of 3 Xanax prescriptions issued to Linda in the past 2 months from 3 different clinics. The final page was a summary of rumors documented in the internal records of the women's club, cited from 2 of Ethan's old acquaintances. Linda flipped through the pages one by one, her expression unchanged. When she finished, she closed the folder, set it down on the stone table in the yard, and looked Ethan straight in the eye. You think I tried to poison you? She asked, her voice hollow. Ethan didn't answer. He simply held her gaze, waiting. A long silence followed. Finally, Linda let out a sigh. I didn't want to kill you, if that's what you're thinking. I just wanted to shake things up a little, make you miss your exhibition, get Sophie to start doubting. She believes in you too much. Why? Ethan asked, his throat dry. Because you're unstable, unreliable, and because Sophie might have chosen a different path, with someone better. Ethan tightened his grip on the camera, not out of anger, but because for the first time he saw true emptiness in that woman's eyes, not cruelty, but despair. And that was even more terrifying than the poison in that glass. That night, just as Ethan returned home, Sophie's phone began to ring repeatedly. She looked at the screen, hesitated, then picked up. It was her mother, Linda. Her shrill voice echoed through the speaker. Sweetheart, I don't even know how to say this, but I just had a strange conversation with Ethan. I'm really worried. He accused me of things, threatened me, and he seemed unstable. I'm afraid you might be living with someone who has issues. Sophie said nothing at first, then replied curtly, I understand, Mom. She turned to Ethan, her eyes filled with confusion. I need to hear it from you. Ethan didn't answer right away. He walked into his office, returned with a sealed envelope he had prepared earlier, and placed it on the table. I wasn't going to show you this, he said. I wanted to keep it to myself. But now I don't have a choice. Inside were copies of the toxicology report, Linda's prescriptions, screenshots of text conversations between Ethan and Josh, the friend at the lab. There were also notes from people who had known Linda at the women's club, and an audio recording from a previous call, where Linda subtly hinted that Ethan isn't good enough for my daughter. Sophie turned each page, listened to every clip. She tried to remain calm, but her eyes began to show cracks of uncertainty. "Do you remember the night of her birthday?" Ethan asked, voice low. "I was exhausted after 3 days of camping out in the woods, shooting for National Geographic. And still I came. I brought cake." I smiled, even though I knew I'd never be enough in their eyes. Sophie sat down slowly, gripping the hem of her shirt. I used to think they were just strict, that they'd never do anything to actually hurt you. Do you still think that now?" Silence fell between them. Sophie didn't answer, but her gaze had shifted from suspicion to doubt. She didn't say, "You're right." She didn't say, "My mother's wrong." But for the first time, Ethan saw something in her eyes he had never seen before. Hesitation. The first crack in a blind trust she had always given her parents. A few days after the tense conversation between Ethan and Sophie, while the atmosphere in the house was still thick with unresolved doubts, an unexpected figure appeared. Vanessa, the wife of Lucas, Sophie's younger brother. She came by while Ethan was in his office, working on a camera, holding a small silver USB drive, and wearing a hesitant expression. "I wasn't sure if I should give this to you," Vanessa said, "but I think you need to see it." That USB drive turned out to be the final piece of the puzzle. Crucial evidence Ethan never expected to come from the quietest member of the family. Vanessa, who had always stayed out of arguments and family politics, turned out to be the only one who had silently observed everything. As Ethan plugged the USB into his computer, Vanessa stood beside him, fingers nervously intertwined. The video that played was from a security camera in the kitchen, a tiny cam Vanessa had once installed to keep an eye on her child during family gatherings. The footage began with Linda preparing a drink. She discreetly took a pill from her bag and dropped it into a glass of water. Her lips moved, mouthing the words, "Something special for my dear son-in-law." A few minutes later, Richard entered the kitchen, picked up the wrong glass, and drank it all. Linda screamed, and the two of them began arguing furiously. In the middle of their fight were lines Ethan had never heard before, but they said everything. "You idiot. That was for Ethan, not you. You've ruined everything. The whole plan to get her to leave that guy." Ethan sat frozen, eyes locked on the screen. Vanessa quietly pulled a slip of paper from her pocket with the video's timestamp and said, "I heard them fighting when I went to get some cake. I didn't want to get involved. But this has gone too far." When Sophie returned home, Ethan didn't say a word. He just handed her the USB. No explanation was needed. When the video ended, Sophie didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't get angry. She simply let out a sigh, a breath of someone who had just let go of an illusion they'd held onto for far too long. And the look she gave Ethan in that moment was no longer conflicted. It was clear. 2 days after the truth was revealed through the video on the USB, Ethan decided it was time to bring everything to an end, publicly, clearly, with no more room for manipulation or misunderstanding. He invited Vanessa and Owen, Sophie's younger brother, over for a family meeting. Sophie sat beside him, silent, but her eyes told a different story. No longer defensive, but waiting for answers. Once everyone had gathered, Ethan turned on a small projector. In the quiet living room, only the familiar footage echoed. The image of Linda secretly dropping a pill into a glass, Richard mistakenly drinking it, then the two of them arguing, accidentally revealing their plot to sabotage Ethan and Sophie's marriage. Owen jumped to his feet at first, his glare piercing Ethan. "Is this staged? My mother would never do something like this." Ethan calmly handed over additional documents, the toxicology report from the lab, prescription records from 3 different doctors, text messages from Linda to Sophie that reeked of control. Then Ethan spoke, not with anger, but with exhaustion. I don't need anyone to believe me. But everything here is true. All I want is for Sophie to know the full story, not filtered through anyone else's lens. Vanessa spoke up for the first time during the meeting. I used to think I was just being paranoid. But looking back, Mom always found ways to make you doubt Ethan. Even Richard got pulled into it. It started with control and turned into manipulation. Sophie sat still, not crying, not reacting, just quietly staring at the blank screen when the video ended. And in that moment, memories flooded back, from her mother's ambiguous comments to the times Ethan had been unfairly criticized. She turned to Ethan and took his hand for the first time since that birthday night. Owen finally sat down, head in his hands. I don't even know what to think anymore. I grew up with him, but there are things I never saw. Ethan nodded. Same here, until I had no choice but to see. The atmosphere in the room no longer carried the weight of doubt. It carried the weight of truth, painful but necessary. 1 week after the tense family meeting, Ethan decided that things needed to be resolved once and for all, not just for himself, but for Sophie as well. He planned another family gathering, but this time there would be no silence, no justifications. He wasn't going to let Linda and Richard slip away from the truth so easily. With meticulous preparation, Ethan brought along a video camera, and as everyone took their seats at the table, he said nothing. He simply turned on the projector. The screen lit up, and instantly Linda and Richard realized what was coming. The familiar footage from a USB appeared again. This time, not only the scene of their argument after Richard drank the wrong glass, but additional clips from other hidden cameras capturing secret conversations between the two. Manipulative text messages from Linda, attempts to make Sophie doubt her husband. It was all there, undeniable and crystal clear. Linda and Richard sat frozen, faces pale. They were used to half-hearted conversations, verbal sparring without evidence. But this was different. Ethan had come fully prepared, leaving no room for excuses. Sophie sat next to Ethan, staring at her parents. She felt the heaviness in the air, but also knew this was the moment she had to speak. She turned toward Linda and Richard, not with softness, not with the look of a daughter desperate to please her parents anymore. "I love you," Sophie began, her voice calm but firm, "but what you've done is unforgivable. I can't continue living in a relationship where love is manipulated and twisted to fit someone else's desires." The room fell into silence. No one dared to speak. Linda and Richard, despite being her parents, couldn't escape the gaze of disappointment and disillusionment from their daughter. Sophie stood up, not looking back, but her eyes had said it all. She would no longer allow anyone, not even her family, to sabotage her happiness again. That was the final turning point, a counterstrike that Ethan and Sophie had prepared for. And though it was painful, they knew it was necessary to finally free themselves from the shadow of manipulation. 6 months after the intense confrontation, things began to change. Ethan and Sophie's family started attending therapy, a necessary step to heal old wounds. Linda and Richard, though not completely transformed, at least kept their distance from Ethan and Sophie. Their relationship was no longer as tense as before, but there was clearly an unbridgeable gap. Respect had gradually formed, but it remained fragile. Ethan continued on his path of freedom, turning down a tempting offer from his father-in-law's company, a large corporation with an exorbitant salary. He knew that accepting it would mean burying everything he had built with passion and independence. Sophie understood and supported her husband's decision, standing by his side as she had promised throughout their difficult journey. On a quiet afternoon, Sophie shared unexpected happy news. They were expecting their first child, a baby girl named Eliza. Both were overjoyed, and Ethan felt his life had completely transformed. From being manipulated and trapped in the shadow of his in-laws, he had now found light and a new purpose. When Sophie was hospitalized to give birth, Linda and Richard, for the first time, truly respected the boundaries Ethan and Sophie had set. They came to visit baby Eliza, but this time there was no interference or control from them. It was the first time they treated their daughter and son-in-law as a real family. Ethan also opened his own photo gallery, where he could showcase his work without judgment. Sophie remained by his side, not just as his wife, but also as his companion on his journey of freedom and creativity. For them, victory was not about revenge or proving someone wrong. It was about living authentically, and that was the most precious gift they could have in life. The valuable lesson from Ethan and Sophie's story is this: freedom and authenticity in life do not always come from gaining others' approval, but from staying true to oneself. Life doesn't always go as we wish. Sometimes we face challenges and manipulation from loved ones, parents, family, or friends. Despite the skepticism and judgment from his in-laws, Ethan remained steadfast on his own path. He rejected lucrative opportunities to stay true to his photography career, not for money or fame, but because he understood the value of living honestly with his passion and abilities. We can learn that we don't always have to accept the control or judgment of others. Negative words, doubts, or unrealistic expectations from people can make us feel inadequate, but what matters is recognizing our true worth, listening to our inner voice, and having the courage to stand up for it. When life is challenging and we face tough decisions, the most important thing is not to lose ourselves. Living authentically and honestly is a true victory. Ethan and Sophie overcame hardships, confronted lies and manipulation, but in the end, they found peace, freedom, and happiness. Ultimately, the key lesson is never let anyone or anything control your life. Hold on to your self-belief, pursue your passions, and stay true to yourself, because that is the path to genuine success and happiness.